going to have two presentations, first of all, on the two projects that are the sort of foundation for what we're talking about here. So we're going to have the TrainRDM and the SMARDY project. So we'll have presentations which are overviews of those. So to get to that immediately, I'd like to invite Cyprian Dobre, Professor of Computer Science at University Polytechnic of Bucharest and Director of Mobilab, the Laboratory on Pervasive Products and Services. So Cyprian, if you would like to come up, please. And there we go.
Perfect. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for having me here at NCI. And thank you for the introduction, for the nice introduction. So the main purpose of our meeting here relates to these two interesting, I would say, projects. And I'd like to introduce the first one, which is called Open Science and Research Data Management Innovative and Distributed Training Program. I know it's a long name, but for short, it's TrainRDM. Okay. So what is it all about? And both projects are in the same area. We are targeting basically work in this fourth dimension of science, right? Because science developed in different stages. And right now, as you can see here, we are in the stage of the data intensive science, where actually data is at the front post of every decision we are making. So we are surrounded, let's say, by data. We have many data. Sorry. Okay. Okay.
Okay. Sarah? You just have someone coming in on there?
Yeah, sorry, I just had to mute them there.
Certainly, thank you. Okay, sorry, please proceed.
Okay, so all the decisions we are currently making and all the methodologies around our ideas have to involve some form of data-based science, right? So in the context of these two projects, we say that data creates new business opportunities. And these slides, of course, thanks to Jim Gray for being here. And then in terms of these benefits, for research, there are many benefits. Sorry. Did I
want to share your screen just probably because we're seeing it from the background.
It makes sense now.
Yeah. It makes share your screen. Okay. Okay, that should be better now.
Except
so.
Okay. Yeah. It's better now. So the benefits for research have to involve many different dimensions, starting from the public benefits, and we have different aspects that surround us. Okay, we are coming from the academia sector, and our own research and academic papers have to support in the end reproducibility. The trust in our science have to deal also with the existence of data. The data needs to be trusted. And on the other side of the story, there are many research communities who can actually benefit from the data, right? Because we can use the data to support our own teaching activities, for example, and many more aspects can be supported by having data, and data need actually to come with good references. So data quality becomes really important. And also there are many other benefits, like data could support more easily, let's say, a public engagement, right, in compliance with grant rules. So we all receive money for our research, but in the end, we need to prove that the research is valid, that the results are there. In terms of global collaboration, for example, right, we need to collaborate, and how to better collaborate than by actually reusing data. My own research could support the next generation projects instead of reusing the same ideas all over again and repeating my own experiments. And you can see here, there are many such dimensions. And with all this data, now everything becomes open science. Open science is real. Open science actually surrounds our own existence. And we see a movement in this direction of open science all around the world. I'm talking here about the support for analysis, for example, for publication, for data gathering. For data gathering, it's really interesting to actually rely on citizens to support your idea and actually come up with the right data to understand in the end and to draw the right conclusions. And we have many platforms, and technology can support us in all this collaboration. So just to give you a hint of the benefits and drivers of openness, everything needs to actually become open. We can better support integrity, transparency, and quality, right? Because in the end, the evidence can better be supported by opening our own conclusions and reducing, for example, the risk of academic fraud. Then we have the benefit of impact and longevity, right? Because in the end, if my work is supported by some form of data, the data actually can support other scientists who will cite my work. So basically, we are talking about new science metrics that could support our careers. And of course, the speed, because the research process becomes faster, right? I mean, everyone can actually validate my own funding and my own conclusions. And durability, fewer important data sets will be lost because the data is lost every time. And then, of course, the final one has to deal with efficiency, accessibility, and use of science. Now, in this context, the project supports open access and research data management. So how actually are we supposed to deal with all this data and how to properly open the data to others and make it available to the public audience? And the research data management is not really that easy because it involves also policies, practices, and procedures, the right procedures needed to manage the storage, the right access, preservation of data produced from a research project. It's not just, okay, put the data in the repository and that's it. No, we need actually to think in terms of how to support the standardization process in this area, how to actually understand better the metadata, to understand better what is really needed from us to put it there in the right technology. And we have more, of course, digital data. Actually, the evidence shows that globally speaking, scientific output doubles every 9 years. And this is currently even accelerating even further. And the data becomes more fragile. Instead of relying heavily on the data, we should also rely on the quality of the right data, because data is there, but not all of it is of good quality in the end to support our conclusions. And we see, of course, a policy transition also in the way we, as scientists, publish our own findings. Basically, in the last years, and this actually started in 2016 with Springer, they launched actually this data policy standardization initiative, where actually they encourage scientists to think in terms of publishing their results. And they came up with these 4 types of policies for publication of data and also the articles, basically ranging from the first process, type 1, who says only just data sharing and data citation is encouraged but not required, all the way to type 4, which actually means that data sharing, evidence of data sharing, and peer review of data is mandatory actually for publishing your own work. And we can see that similar initiatives then were followed by all the major publishers around the world. Elsevier, Wiley, Taylor, Francis, everyone actually supports this kind of direction, transition towards open data and open access. And of course, this is also a trend in Horizon Europe, in the new finance program, where actually the data and the idea of opening the science becomes mandatory in many aspects. And this is actually by contract in many of the new projects that will start in this framework program, Horizon Europe. This is actually something that is right from their side. So in this context, we need to support education around open science, to support the right training and the formation of the right skills for scientists, librarians, and everyone actually working in the field. And I'm talking here about mapping the gaps, these gaps between training and education on sound data management. I already mentioned research data management, how to do it right, in the right manner. And of course, the data management plan is mandatory now in all the universities and non-public institutions, but we need to understand for our own methodologies, scientists, how to do it right, to follow the proper procedures, policies around the data management aspects. Then we are talking about preservation of scientific information. Work with librarians to come up with the right procedures to preserve it. And then research integrity, because fraud is something that is happening, and we can actually support a new direction here by opening the data to actually make others see that our work is there, is valid, is a real contribution. Then we are talking about science communication, public engagement, and then participatory research methodologies. And we see that new, let's say, practices and directions are being formed. We are talking now about the importance of the existence of data curators, data stewards. Of course, everyone already has some form of data science officers in different institutions. All of them actually need to work together to support open science, right? And this is the framework of the project, the exchange of good practice and mutual learning. And in the end, all the training that is supported in this project evolve around the 61 open science-related transferable skills for early career researchers. So we are not addressing our work to, let's say, mature scientists, but to the new generation of researchers coming behind and who will better understand how the opening of the science will benefit in the end their work, right? So this is the project. The whole project TrainRDM empowers the education and skills dimension of open science with innovative mechanisms and tools for skill trainings for research data management good practices. Now, the objectives are, we are starting from the analysis and map of the skills, right? Training needs for open science and research data management in partner higher education institutions with different open science dimensions. We started from different analysis. We started from previous work. For example, LERU already has some good practices that we need to follow, and many other networks actually support the same idea. Then we review existing good practices in open science and RDM skills training. We try to develop, and this is the current phase of the project, an open science and research data management training methodology toolkit, and then we are starting with good quality pilot training programs to see exactly what happens, because in the end, we are trying to build a platform for training activities. Now, this is really the interest part for myself, because I'm a technical person, to support distributed learning infrastructure around Europe. For example, somebody here at NCI could have good skills on IPR, because intellectual properties are really important for opening the data and other parts. And somebody in DN, for example, could support other aspects of the methodology, for example, fair policies. And basically, by combining our forces in different universities, we could form new master modules that are really inter-European intervention. Yeah. Okay, and during the project lifetimes, these are the phases. It's an Erasmus Plus project. We have 3 different intellectual outputs, different events for students, summer school, for early stage researchers, because these 2 categories are the main focus interest for our project. And then we'll have a final conference. You're all invited already to this event to find out the conclusions. Thank you. This is TrainRDM. Also the links. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to invite Horacio Gonzalez Velez, Head of Cloud Competency here at the National Conference of Ireland, to talk to us about the SMARDY project, which he will explain in detail.
I hope so.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's just try this. Here we go. I need to Zoom events. What is it?
If you
stop share and I share again. This one. Okay.
So if you go full screen and maybe minimize, if you just there and everyone can see.
This is the Zoom world now.
Yes.
Good. So it should be online. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Before I start, particularly for people who are here locally, just make sure you get a drink or something. So otherwise, it doesn't get cold, but guys, help yourselves, get a drink, get a sandwich. For anyone who is remote, unfortunately, we cannot send you the sandwich or the drink, but I hope that the presentation is interesting enough. So my name is Horacio González Vélez. I work here at NCI as an associate professor and I run the Cloud Competency Center here. So good morning, well, good afternoon, everyone. As I was saying, I'm going to be talking about SMARDY. This is a European project funded by an instrument called Eureka, and we are very happy to be working on this. And I'm going to give you some details of where we're coming from. So, okay. First and foremost, we are going to be talking about open data, okay? And why this is relevant? Because open data is data that anyone can access, use, and share. As usual, yep. I feel like, okay, it's data that anyone can access, use, and share. That means it's not, if I find it on the internet, that doesn't mean necessarily that it's open data, okay? So that's a common misunderstanding here. And I'm fortunate enough to have a few of my students here on the room. And I keep on telling that because if I find a wallet in the street, that doesn't mean that the wallet is me. And in the same sense, data is something that we have to understand that has to have a license, you have to be accessed. But most importantly, when it's open data, governments and businesses and individuals can bring benefits. It is about what we can do with that, okay? So with this audience, with this educated audience, online and here in the room, I feel like I'm trying to teach my grandmother to suck eggs. Because, of course, you are convinced of the importance of data, of the relevance, and this is a movement across Europe. These are the EU 28, yes, the UK is still there. And this is the 2020 Open Data Maturity Model. And you can tell this is a score calculated overall. Happy to report that Ireland is always at the top 3, traditionally. The best country for open data, according to this study, is Denmark. Okay, so, and it actually takes into account 4 criteria, which is the policy to underpin data, the portal. They have the national portal for open data, their impact that the open data is on the economy, and the quality of the release. So from that perspective, it's happy to say that Ireland is well on that. Additional statistics on that, just to give you an example, according to this source, it is expected that open data represents 320 billion, okay, euros in size. And there are 100,000 jobs directly associated with open data. Okay, and it has experienced a 30% compound growth over the past 5 years. Okay, so imagine a small town of 100,000 people working just on open data, but generating 325 billion in size. Well, that would be an interesting economy. So if we look at from the perspective of Ireland itself, I would say the ranking, okay, has changed over time. These are, as I was saying, top 3, top 4, okay? And interesting enough, there are 2 parts that we are lagging from the rest of Europe, which is on policy and on impact. So generating money and the policies that can support. However, in terms of the portal that underpins that and the quality of data that's available, we're right there. So the overall, we're above the mark, but still there is some to do. And that's why we believe as an economy that we have. And I talk about data set value and in general open data value, right? So how do we know something generates value, specifically in data? Well, the policy, strictly speaking, there is the Article 14 of the EU Open Data Directive means that in order for me to claim that a data set has value, either there are benefits, socioeconomical or to the environment, okay? And I can generate services. It benefits users, but specifically SMEs. So there is an emphasis on that. And can assist in generate revenues, of course, and can be combined with other data sets, okay? So the fact that a data set is open, has value, okay, has to be in this space. So it has to have a benefit, particularly for SMEs, assist in generating revenue, and can be combined. So, okay, and that's where we come here with this project. So this project is SMARDY specifically. The idea is that we are trying to generate a marketplace for open data, interesting. And it's about software and data carpentries. In other words, the ability to exchange curated data sets, technology, and tools for economic and social development. So again, if you think about that, it's the generation of value from data and the ability to do. But there is a clear trade-off if you think in your heads to a certain extent. Many people would believe that if something is free, I cannot generate value, right? And we've been now in the millennial economy, we are quite used that if I don't pay for something, it's because I'm the product. The typical question that I pose is, do you pay for Google? Do you pay for Facebook? And everyone, certainly try that with your Auntie Maureen at home. Everyone would say, no, I don't pay. Of course, you go on. In this audience, you will tell, no, look, what you do pay because you have the use, the utilization. But what about in open? If it's truly open, how do you generate value? How do you expect to give something but still generate value? And that's what we are trying to do, because as it happens, particularly in science, we have seen a trend. So there is not much that we can do at what it's called the bottom of technology. Semiconductors, no matter what we do, the gate size, it's not going to be reduced much more than the 10 nanometers that we are now. Under 10 nanometers, it's getting tough. Okay, so it had to be at the top as it is. And pretty much the opportunities in software, engineering, and in this idea on how to do things faster. So this is an article that appeared last year in Sciences with Charles Lerserson and a few others. So you want to check it, it's particularly interesting because we would like to believe that that's what we can bring value. If you think of the traditional way of consuming data, you have people who generate data, okay? So gender balance, ties, okay? Open data, data repository, and consumption. That's a traditional way of looking at it. I just release something and I expect that someone will consume it. Or in other words, build it and they will come. But what about if there is a way to still release it as open, but to a certain extent keep an eye on the provenance, okay? The reason why you are probably consuming this food, people who are here, it's that because you trust brands, you trust who is behind something. You know that there is a preparation, there is something behind, okay? That's what we would expect with data. If we could understand where it was from, where it came, what it's behind, still have proper curated data sets, data repositories, and potentially have tools that enables some domain specifics. So that's what we are trying to do. So a data carpentry or a software carpentry, if you are familiar with the term, the idea is to enable tools and data to be exploited in an open data, open source fashion, and ultimately to do open science, the ability to reproduce results. Okay, so that's pretty much it. So the idea of this presentation is to tell you about this project, open the floor to debate, and my two colleagues, Anthony and Claire, will be coming with the industry side. So I hope I did more or less the 10 minutes. Thank you.
So now to provide a little context, I suppose, and to widen the conversation after hearing the overviews for TrainRDM and the SMARDY projects, we're going to have some industry speakers. So we're going to have two speakers on different aspects of it. So the first is Claire Dillon, founder of the Open Network in Ireland and executive director of Inner Source Commons. She's an expert in the area of open source software, and she's going to give us some context in terms of how the future is open source and the lessons that open source can provide for open science and open data and the collaboration that can exist between the two. Then we're also going to have Anthony McCauley, who is AI Network Project Manager for Technology Ireland, the ICT SkillNet. And the title of his presentation is somewhat provocative insofar as he says, "In God we trust, everyone else bring data." So again, it's showing how AI in combination with all of the other ingredients can multiply the power of open data, open science, and open source and what can be done. So I see Claire has shared her screen, so thank you for that. The other thing just to say is we have a couple of polls that we're going to run as well. So people online can interact directly with them. What we might do, Sarah, if we could share a screen to make sure that the polls can be displayed on the screen, and we might just do a show of hands in the room on those. So Claire, if you're ready, we'll invite you to begin, please.
Thank you, Paul. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you fine. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, first of all, I'd like to say how disappointed I am not to be there in person. But thank you all very much for inviting me along to speak today. I really appreciate it. I'll probably counter the idea that I'm an expert because I feel like this is a lot of what I'm going to talk about. I'm on a learning journey as well. So I would like to just emphasize the fact that for me, this is all about learning, as the use of open source in so many areas, and in fact in inner source, which I'm deeply involved with, is emerging and evolving over time. So I don't know if there are any bona fide experts that have been around for too long in this, certainly in the inner source area anyway. To give a little bit of background from my perspective, as Paul mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of Inner Source Commons. Inner Source Commons is a non-for-profit organization, global organization, a community of practitioners of inner source, which is the use of open source methods and practices within organizations. So it's open collaboration, but creating proprietary code, but often on a path to open source to help industry organizations get into the open source community. So that's Inner Source. As he also mentioned, I am a co-founder of Open Ireland Network, which is a relatively new organization, again, a community organization of volunteers here in Ireland who are hoping to bring together the community of folks who are interested in the open ecosystem, so that we can all get to know each other and help promote the idea of open in Ireland. It encompasses not just open source practitioners or even inner source practitioners, but also we want to to link in with the pre-existing open data community as well. I will note at this point that in my experience, sorry, one more thing before I finish the wearing of hats. There is one more organization which perhaps is relevant to this discussion, which I'm also involved in, and that's an organization called the OSPO++ Network, which is a community and network for folks that are creating open source program offices in universities, governments, and civic institutions. And that is, again, very recent organization, only founded in 2020, where people are talking about the professionalization and how do we actually accelerate the adoption of open source within universities in particular. That's where it started. So that may also be relevant to this conversation. It dawned to me as I was listening to some of the earlier presentations. So we might look at that again. Is it okay if we end this poll and I start now? Paul, is that? Yes,
please, Sarah. If you can I poll this for now, we'll come back to it.
Thank you. Brilliant. So I will just remove that and hopefully you can all see my screen. Now, so first of all, I think it's worthwhile noting, and many folks in the room will note, that open source software in terms of software development has certainly won, as the open source community would like to say. I think a number of years ago, there was a doubt that this would happen, right? There were a lot of folks who were involved in the open source community who were doing it as a kind of a part-time or perhaps a passion project on the side. And there was a little bit of doubt about whether or not this would be ever adopted seriously at scale by large enterprises, but that's not the case anymore. So in a recent Red Hat, in the recent Red Hat open source report, they would be reporting that at least 90% of IT leaders are now using enterprise open source software. In fact, it's probably worthwhile saying that most of the areas of innovation today in industry are heavily reliant on open source software. So the use of it is undisputed. But I think there is a way to go in terms of actually getting organizations and enterprises involved and actually contributing back to the open source community. There is, of course, a really close link between open source software and open data and how together they can be very complementary, as Horacio mentioned earlier, both from an economic perspective, but also just from a research translation perspective. And perhaps we'll touch on that later. But in terms of where it's being used, traditionally speaking, the most of the open source software is being used in IT infrastructure modernization and digital transformation projects around DevOps, typically in that kind of higher tech end of the ecosystem in terms of where it is being used across industry. But relatively speaking, very heavy usage in the US, but actually, growing usage across the world. So a lot more people are actually focusing on open source as areas of growth and looking at the skills there as they are, as I've just learned, in the university and academic sectors as well. And I think this is for a number of reasons, certainly from my experiences of talking to industry and looking at why and how they're using open source methods and practices in open source software. What you can see is that it's very clear that this accelerates research and development. So, I mean, why rebuild something that's already out there being used by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of developers? So there is the reuse factor, which again, people will be very familiar with. But people may not be as familiar with the idea of developer productivity and how open collaborative methods actually increases developer productivity, regardless about whether or not they're creating open source software or not. So it turns out in a recent report by one of the large analyst firms, they were looking at the correlation between developer practices and productivity and output from the companies. And they found that actually just using the open source methods, not even using open source code, actually increases developer productivity and accelerated results. So that's one of the reasons that, for example, we in Inner Source Commons would see an increase in the adoption of Inner Source, not only as a pathway to open source, but also as a way in which they can actually just improve their own software development methods and accelerate things, break down silos and increase collaboration within organizations' firewalls. But I think one of the interesting areas that probably hasn't been maybe pushed as far as it could is this idea of frictionless collaboration. I was involved with a project and I'm aware of a project that a collaboration that happened across the Atlantic between the City of Paris and Johns Hopkins University and a local nonprofit called St. Francis Neighborhood Center, which is working in a really deprived part of Baltimore City. And they decided to actually do a collaboration, which they took some software services that were created by the City of Paris to use. Johns Hopkins took it and to use and implement it for the benefit of St. Francis Neighborhood Center. Now, so you've got basically a city in Europe, you've got a large research university in America, and you've got a tiny little nonprofit in Baltimore City that wouldn't have that much resources to actually, you know, put into the administration about such various different collaborations. And you look at that and you say, well, okay, how could that have been done if we were using proprietary software? And the gentleman who's involved in this and has led that collaboration, his name is Saeed Chowdhury from Johns Hopkins University. He's the founder of the open source program office there. He was saying that he got that done in such a very short period of time because everything was open source. And he said that if he had tried to instigate such a collaboration cross-Atlantic between a city, the university, and this tiny little like nonprofit, he probably would still 6 months later been wrangling with legal and NDAs and the license agreements and understanding where the IP transfer was. He would never have been able to achieve the impact that he did had he not been able to do it through open source. And what we're seeing now actually is that industry are cottoning onto that too. So they're realizing that actually if you're looking for frictionless collaboration, if you want things to happen as quickly as possible, then sometimes you need to be able to do it within the context of a well-known framework like open source software, like open source licenses. And by doing that, you can actually get to the end result quicker, not just from a technical perspective, but also from an administrative or bureaucratic perspective. So that I think is an area that perhaps has not been emphasized in the past, but industry are certainly realizing the benefits in that respect. The second thing is that actually people are saying that it's higher quality software. This is one of the main results that came back from the Red Hat survey. So that because number one, there are more people necessarily using some of these packages, but also because they often have access to the latest innovations, whereas proprietary software may not. So they're accelerating faster in terms of innovation, so that the software that's available through open source can often be higher quality. The third one is the fact that there's shared risk. Now, security often comes up as a blocker or a myth in terms of, or it's put forward as a problem in the context of open source. However, most of the research in this area would suggest that open source software is no more insecure than proprietary software. It's not like the one is more secure or insecure than the other. However, one of the things that happens in the context of open source software is that oftentimes the risks are better known, more transparent, and often get addressed quicker than the cases in proprietary software, where you really don't know when you will be alerted to the fact that there may be a security issue, nor do you have any control or agency in terms of being able to address the issue. And you don't know who shares the risk with you, whereas it's the opposite in the open source world, where there is a shared risk. So when something in an open source package goes wrong, the vast number of people who may be using that all get together to help resolve the issue. So that shared risk becomes an area or a benefit that appeals to a lot of corporates. And then there's a higher trust, right? So this has been reported now as being a very important thing or context when we think about the idea of increasing trust to increase the adoption of technology. And it turns out that in many cases, it's really important for people to be able to, or to know they can, even if they don't ever do it, but to know they can view code and understand what's happening under the hood in order to be able to trust software, in order to adopt it more quickly. And in this world, where the adoption of software can sometimes be a bigger challenge than the creation of software, it becomes an incredibly important point. I will also just briefly mention the fact that, oftentimes again, and I think Horacio mentioned this about the idea that if something is free and freely available, you can often think, well, therefore there is no value. However, what we're seeing in the industry is that actually there's a huge amount of value being created, economic value being created from the open source community. And there is an organization called CostMedia, and they are tracking all the investments that are happening in open source companies, commercial open source companies. That's the cost that's there. there, so commercial open source companies. And they are marking and recording all the investments that are happening. And they said that in 2020, back in November 2020, it actually was the first month in history that the funding into startups exceeded $600 million. But any of you who are tracking this industry will probably have again looked at things like the GitLab IPO that happened relatively recently, where it was valued at over $6 billion for an open source company. So I think the idea that these open source companies can't actually create economic value is kind of gone, dead and gone, which is good. And there are a number of emerging business models that are appearing in industry when we think about the open source companies. The first is, for example, accelerating just in terms of accelerating the customer development, as we talked about before, accelerating research and development. The second one is that there's a number of organizations who are providing the support necessary for organizations to be able to feel comfortable to use the open source software. So that's a really common model. People would be familiar with Red Hat. That would be one of their value propositions. So this is, when organizations want a throat choke in the context of using some enterprise software, oftentimes there are emerging business models which make it that viable for them. And it's a very important point because it's been one of the blockers to the use of open source in many areas, but that's now being mitigated by this emergence of these support companies. And so commercial off-the-shelf open source vendors are a thing, and there are large numbers of people who are perfectly prepared to pay additional money in terms of actually getting support and having someone to ring at 2 a.m. in the morning when something goes wrong. The third area is, of course, the emergence of software as a service, which has meant that when there are certain organizations who have fully open source projects, they've open sourced all the software, but they make their money by running it as a service because people just couldn't be bothered doing it themselves. Very viable business model. SaaS has really accelerated the commercial opportunities around open source in that respect. The third area is the idea of customizing open source. So in many respects, the services industry ecosystem that surrounds each of the projects is very vibrant. And so the idea of taking a project and customizing it for a given vertical or a given organization is a really valid business model. And then the third one is the idea of custom services on an ongoing basis for the product. I think the idea of application developers who use open source to accelerate their services they provide to their customers is well known. What we're seeing now is the emergence of some companies who do that, but who insist in their licensing that the end result will be also open sourced. And what's happening now is that you therefore get some organizations who are building a product as they're providing services. And for those of you familiar with the startup world, there's always been this challenge and tension between the idea of a product company and a services company. And they are often seen to be perhaps in competition with each other from a resources perspective internally. But in this case, you've got a complementary set of services that as they're providing custom services, the core product also gets improved for everyone. Future clients, current clients, and past clients. So this is additional value that these companies can provide their customers because everything is being done in the open. And then there's the idea of open core. Now I'll put this one with an advisory notice because it's a controversial one, but it does happen. So there are many organizations still out there who are creating an open source or open sourcing a part of their product and then charging for additional features that they may add on top of that. The reason why I have a cautionary note on this is because this model over time does run into trouble. It causes sometimes a little bit of dissatisfaction from communities who perhaps are expecting something for free and then realize that it's been put behind a paywall. And it can cause friction for some of the organizations that go down this path. So this one is one that happens, but perhaps should be done in a cautionary way, because it very frequently can backfire over time as a strategy for commercializing an open source project. I'll also mention here a recent research study that was conducted by Fraunhofer and Open Forum Europe. This, I believe, is being launched perhaps again this week. We've seen a number of previews, so I can share here some of the results and the summary of the results that was actually shared a number of months ago. But I think the final version, I think, is out this week, but I will double check on that. But they did a research into, again, as Horacio mentioned from open data, the economic impact. They were looking at the economic impact for open source software for Europe. And what they found was that, number one, there is existing significant investment by EU countries and EU located companies into open source right now. So we're seeing at least $1 billion worth of investment in 2018 at a minimum for labor costs. We're also seeing a significant contribution to the overall GDP of Europe from open source. And they have estimated that if we increased the number of lines of open source code from Europe, that was contributed in a given year of 10%, it would generate an additional $1 billion, €1 billion per year in the future. So for every 10% increase in actual contributions, we would see 100 billion, euros in the EU in GDP per year, which is significant, huge. And again, looking at it from a country like Ireland, that could have a huge uplift for all of us in terms of the economic benefits that we would do, and for every country who might participate in that. We're also seeing a tie between the number of foundations of startups and the contributions to open source code. So again, an increase of 10% in open source code contributions would generate additional 1,000 startups per year. And certainly for my work in the OSPO++ network, what we're seeing is that you're starting to see clusters around universities who are doing stuff in open source software. Then they actually create this ecosystem that surrounds them, where people are taking the code and building either services or accelerating and building products or additional products on top of whatever that core open source competency is. That's not just because of awareness, but it's because of the actual ecosystem, personal connections, and all the goodness that happens with any kind of ecosystem like that. But it happens faster than any kind of IP transfer initiative might allow, because of the frictionless innovation potential around this. So again, a very important point when we think about the industry connection to open source. So then again, they noted the fact that there was a savings in total cost of ownership in the public sector, but I think more importantly, this was actually tied to an avoidance of vendor lock-in, and that would be the software vendors, but also the actual service suppliers that might be creating custom software for people. So these kinds of lock-in can actually be very costly over time, and certainly result in people paying for repeatedly the same software in different departments or different parts across a company or part of government, and that's what this avoids. However, this old notion that open source software is always free, particularly when you take it in the context of, for example, consuming it as a SaaS product, or in fact paying it for the appropriate levels of support, that's no longer really valid. So when we think about free open source software, we can't think about it as free in terms of money, because you still have to invest, but you can think about it in terms of having a lower overall total cost of ownership. And then there are, of course, further benefits related to open source and standards and such like. So for me, if I think about the future of open source software in the context of industry, I think that we're going to continue to see it as a lever that is used in the context of accelerating research and development, often in the context of using open data and the nice complementary idea of within open science of actually having open data, but also the open source software that can help you, understand the data, visualize the data, manipulate the data, whatever it might be doing. But having those together is essential. And of course, industry sees that too. And that research translation into industry from potentially from universities can happen faster if it's all done in the open. We're also seeing a very significant level of professionalization in the context of open source, in the terms of the creation of open source program offices, not only in industry, which is very common these days, but now across universities and governments and other civic institutions. And also the idea of more and more software developers learning the skills, tools of the trade through things like inner source, even before they actually get into the open source world, that too can help with the skills development and the overall professionalization of the ecosystem. We're starting to very particularly see a vertical industry focus, where we actually have specific groups of organizations coming together to build open source across a particular vertical. An example would be the FinOS organization, so the Financial Services Open Source Foundation, and you see all the big banks coming together. I mean, this is completely breaks the stereotype of open source developers being hobbyists in a room somewhere, but you have all these banking professionals coming together to decide to build together horizontal banking solutions in an open way so they can share the risk and accelerate the development. Amazing. And then you have the social and economic development that can happen as a result of deciding to go an open source route. And there's accelerated knowledge transfer, as I mentioned before, because you take away all the bureaucratic friction. And we're starting to see more and more policy formation, even at a European level, point to open source being the preferred route. And it allows for global collaboration, as I mentioned before, as the example between Paris and Baltimore City in the US. So just in terms of next actions, I just wanted to say, I mean, there's so many options in terms of getting more information about open source software. I've just listed the 3 that I happen to be involved in here, the Open Ireland Network, the OSPO++ Network, and the Inner Source Commons Foundation. So if anyone wants to reach out to me or to any of these, we'd love to hear from you. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much. Okay, just before we go to Anthony, I'm just going to see, just put our poll back up on the screen, and just to get some reaction to get some show of hands from the people in the room. So, how does your organization use data to understand the world, create value or business opportunities, test and validate our other products? So, who would say in the room, show of hands, to understand the world primarily? Okay, there's three or four hands there. Okay, to create value or business opportunities. Okay, there's a slightly larger proportion there, maybe a quarter. To test and validate products. 3 or 4 there as well, or other. Nobody under that. Okay, all right. So it's quite clear that test and validate and business opportunities and value are the leaders there. But certainly, as we can see there, there's a reasonable spread. So I'm just going to hide that there for now, and then we have one more presentation before we go to our panel session. So Anthony McCauley is AI Network Project Manager for Technology Ireland ICT SkillNet. He's also a former head of research and innovation at Fujitsu Ireland, and he is the chair of the Industry Advisory Board for the National Masters in Artificial Intelligence delivered by the University of Limerick. So Anthony is going to talk to us about In God We Trust, Everyone Else Brings Data, and how AI is being woven into everything that we're doing and a commercial perspective. So Anthony.
Hello, Paul. Can you hear me okay?
We can, yeah. You're going to share your screen for your slides?
I am. I thought it was.
Okay. I'm going to minimize what I have in front of me here and allow you to.
I thought I had done that. I hope you can see it.
We can. It's in edit view there. Do you want to go into presentation mode? That's it. Excellent. Thank you very much.
Okay. Good afternoon to everybody. And as Paul said, I'm a former head of research at Fujitsu in Ireland. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is some of the mechanisms by which we used open data to further our understanding of some of the areas that we were looking at. In terms of just a little bit about the background of how we used it and what we were using, it was part of a bigger endeavour with respect to research and development that we were undertaking in Ireland. Part of it was involved with a team down in Galway, which were originally called DERI, Digital Enterprise Research Institute, under Professor Stefan Decker. And Stefan Decker would be one of the leading lights of linked open data in the world. And as part of that, we worked with a team of data analysts, mathematicians, computational scientists, and so on, looking at the potential for linked open data and graph theory. And that led us to looking particularly at the use of this technology in the area of cancer research. And we were working with Professor Walter Kolch. And we were also lucky because Professor Walter Kolch is probably one of the leading lights globally in the area of systems biology, which is the application of mathematics, computational science to understanding cell interactions in the body. And that led us onto the development of what we call an enhanced protein interaction platform. Now, the reason I say this is because it was very much based around graph theory, but some of the things that we had learned from the open data was input to that platform and informed some of the models that we created. We were also looking at an area called health informatics, and health informatics is the application of sensing solutions to understand particular aspects of persons' mobility and performance. Again, we were working with clinicians, physiotherapists, consultants, and so on. And obviously using on-body sensors, and that led to the development of a prototype, which has now become a product developed and delivered into the Netherlands. And this was all under the auspices of the Fujitsu Research Laboratory in Tokyo, and I led this locally here in Ireland. So what we were trying to do was develop a patient record, and that record was bringing together these pieces down here, bringing together real-time information, but also looking at particular custom therapies. Now, those custom therapies were informed by some of the models that we developed as part of the use of what we call linked open data and the open data platforms. And I'll give you an idea of that. But also what we did was we used some public data sets, what are called the models we created around gait analytics. And those data, and also health informatics in terms of the performance of people following strokes, the identification of symptoms and indicators as to a person who's going to maybe relapse. So we use those gold standards in order to inform it, and that data, again, was publicly data. So it's the two aspects Horacio referred to it. You have open data, and you also have what's referred to as public data. And that's what I've tried to capture here. So you have this aspect of open data, typically data published by governments, but also other agencies, the World Economic Forum, the OECD, and there's a raft of other bodies who provide what's trusted data that captures various performance of aspects of countries and social aspects. But then you have public data that's provided around various aspects, healthcare, telecommunications, business, and so on. And what we were using was the linked open data cloud. The linked open data cloud is based on a resource definition file. It's called RDF. And it's across a huge number of areas. We were using it with respect to healthcare, but it's also, you can see the various aspects. It's government, life sciences, linguistics, telecommunications, and media. And it has just ballooned over the last number of years. One of the people who used to manage this, and still does, Richard Sianiak, worked with us when we were working in Galway. And it amused me that at the start, they actually did this by hand. And obviously now that's gone. It's just so big, so explosive that this is, it's now automated. But that's what we were working on. We were looking at this linked open data cloud, and we were also using some public data in order to gain an insight and to develop some solutions. The whole idea being that we were developing a knowledge pipeline. So the use of enriching a solution with a combination of linked open data plus unstructured data, which we captured obviously from other means. And that could have been, typically in our case, with social media we were using to inform some of the solutions we were developing. But the whole idea being that we were able to inform, extract information, identify particular aspects of it, and then visualize it. And I cannot stress the importance of data visualization when it comes to open data. The whole idea of being able to see and determine the impact of analysis is key. It catches people's attention, particularly in a commercial environment, the ability to actually see the data, see what you're talking about, see the potential of it, in itself wins over, and in itself is a significant value proposition. So that's what we were trying to do. We were trying to take a vast amount of data. And this, remember, was 12 years ago. We were cutting edge at the time. When I hear a lot of the things being said today, they were the things we were investigating, the whole area of provenance and governance and so on. So what was this curation platform like? And as I said, we were taking a lot of data inputs. We were looking at the cloud itself, the linked open data cloud. We were also looking at public data that was issued by the likes of Google and Yahoo, financial data, medical data. But then we were looking at unstructured data around, as I said, social media. That had to be brought in, and we had what was called a polyglot architecture. Polyglot, simply a fancy name for dealing with multiple different types of ways in which data was, and we had to get it into a structured format. And in those days, it was also challenging in terms of distributed processing. A lot of those problems have now been solved with the likes of Hadoop and Spark. But in those days, about 11 years ago, it wasn't so easy. So we had to consider that in terms of building it. And we then had all the challenges of cleansing the data, curating it, converting it, and then putting it into these RDF maps. So we could create what were called intelligent services. And what we were doing was developing exemplars. At the start, we focused on developing exemplars that could allow us to understand the potential of the platform, understand the potential of using open data, understanding the potential of enriching it with unstructured data, so that we could then go off and do other things as well. So things like sentiment analysis, event context was an aspect of using publicly available data to identify when events were happening. I'll talk a little bit about that. Semantic search, huge area, increasingly important now. I think Capriani talked about it, and so did Horacio. There's just so much data out there now in terms of just understanding the potential of it is huge, particularly in the healthcare field. So it was about developing a platform like this and then building some exemplars on it. And there were three particular things we were looking at in terms of that platform that were key. That was bringing together all this data, ensuring that we had it developed, the platform developed in a way that allows us to reuse it as much as possible in terms of these knowledge modules and augmented knowledge, to allow us to then be able to build exemplars pretty quickly, dependent on the various use cases. And then the final thing was the analytics piece, graphing it, putting it into a representation. So the number one area that we considered and looked at was, use cases. Use cases were absolutely key to driving the value of the platform. And if we were building those use cases, data provenance, and the number of times it's been mentioned today, provenance and governance is central. You have to trust the data, and we had to do that. We had to have a mechanism by which we could map that provenance. We then looked at the aspects in terms of integrity, integration, and the insights, particularly with respect to enriching the data by bringing in other sources. And then that polyglot, that architecture that allowed us to bring in all those different forms of data was absolutely central to the success of what we were doing. So what were the types of little exemplars that we built? And what we did was we looked at particular use cases that we could demonstrate the potential of the platform that we were building. So we could then use the platform in order to determine other ways in which it could be used. So a financial use case was one. We call this a Hikaku platform, which is essentially it's a financial comparison. And what it did was it took data in from the various data sets that you can see on the left-hand side there, and it combined it with what was being said in social media. So what it was this event context aspect to it, allowing you to see what was happening almost in real time with respect to a company's performance, but also seeing the dips and the troughs, the peaks, why it was happening. Some of that was pure financial, or some of it was just sentiment. And we were able to identify that and track that by putting it through different feeds from the data that we were getting from social media. Now, one of the other aspects of this was to be able to do a comparison on a global basis of a corporation's results. And what you could do is you could track inconsistencies, anomalies. So in terms of just looking at a company and what it was saying, as well as what it was publishing, it allowed you to identify the different aspects of that company's performance, both from a financial perspective, from a propaganda perspective, and then from a social media perspective, all done through data that was in the public domain. And this allowed us then to say, look, there's a potential here for this. And we went off and we looked at the different other use cases based on that. Another one, which we called Linkspire, and this very much led to the target of our research in later years, which was looking at the use of or cell interaction leading to various cancers. But this was looking at advanced adverse drug reactions. And what it was allowing us to do is bring in data from the likes of PubBank or PubMed, Drug Bank, Disease Zone, CIDR, to look at the various interactions of drugs and to look at the side effects, using a mechanism called co-occurrence. So what we could do is we could look at the drugs and look at the side effects and look at the treatment of that drugs and the compounds to say, look, there are particular drugs that lead to specific side effects. Is there an equivalent type of drug that those side effects don't occur? So you could identify different types of treatments, lessening the side effects of those drugs. Again, all based on open data, but very much this was all, came to fruition because we had that platform. We were looking at bringing in the various feeds. We were able to reuse the modules we created. We were then able to integrate that data, analyze it, and build these exemplars on top. And this was a solution that we called semantics. I laugh because when we originally came up with this, the researchers, it was an international team. So there were French and Germans and Czechs, and they wanted to call it Semtex. And seeing as we were going back and forward to the UK a lot, I said, look, I don't think Semtex is a good word. We'll change that. So we came up with the word semantics. But semantics allowed us to drill down through a huge corpus of data and identify particular aspects of that based on what a clinician was looking for. So it could identify particular publications. It could identify particular recommendations around what was happening with particular diseases. And what it could have become the basis of was maybe for GPs who wanted to stay in touch, or people in the research space, in the medical research space, because there's just so much data now published, it allowed them to understand the various publications, understand what was relevant to them, and inform some of the decisions they were making. And I just saw a company recently, I think it's called Biologic, and they've just issued or developed a platform. I think it'll be hugely popular for the medical space. But even for my own analysis, the idea of getting a semantic platform is now becoming more and more valuable. So those were the exemplars we built. However, a word of warning, moving from validation, which is what we were using open data and public data for, to commercial solutions is a different kettle of fish. And as we moved more towards building specific types of applications, we did have to enrich it with private data sets. So the open data could bring us only so far. And this data you're seeing here was a private data set that allowed us to, when we were working with Systems Biology Ireland, was able to enrich the data that we had developed, but also enrich the models that we had. But what we were also able to do, we're able to use some gold data sets, as I said, in order to validate some of the platforms. But as you go and you become more sophisticated, and the whole area of IPR, it does become challenging to publish this data. But we published as much as we could. We made it available. When we published publicly, we provided access to the various exemplars. So we contributed to the community as much as we could, but it is worth making the point that due to IPR, due to commercial restrictions, there's only so far you can go without the agreement of large corporations. And in doing that, what Fujitsu did was they established what was called a load for all. And this was a community-based approach to create a platform that brought together all the linked open data sets around the world into a single location, where people could then, through either an API or through a user interface, access the metadata and as a result, the data sources. Now, it was a very challenging, Fujitsu are still working on it, but it's extremely difficult because what you're doing is you're looking at a corpus of data now and data sources right across the world that is growing at a phenomenally exponential rate. And without specific use cases, and I'll come back to this, use cases are key. It is particularly challenged to sell the value of this, but it is something that Fujitsu are doing. They've changed the approach a little bit because of the enormity of the task. But this was us saying, look, there's huge value in this community, and we wanted to give back to that community. And that's what we did with what we called Load for All. So just a couple of concluding remarks with respect to business models. There are a number of business models that we came across, and I came across in terms of investigating linked open data. The whole area of aggregation and data analytics services, data marts, data curation, particularly with respect to linked data, which we were looking at for business services, is a growing area. Tools, the whole area of tooling, particularly around data visualization, that's a growing sector. And particularly the use of these tools to inform policy decision making, because by the very fact that they can inform things like infrastructure, public health systems. That's an area of development. Claire talked about the whole area of the premium model and the challenges it can address. Again, linked open data, there are a lot of people making data sets public on a freemium basis, and then the premium model is you pay for the richer data sets. The Ordnance Survey is one of them. A lot of consultancy at the time. There was a company called Dairy Links in Ireland that were providing consultancy into the Irish government around making data sets public. It does require informed consultancy to do this thing well. And those countries that are doing it well around the world have put a very strict governance model around it, and they've brought in consultants to do that, and they invest in it quite heavily. Security services, again, there's a huge amount of data now in the public domain. The UK would be seen as one of the leaders in this area. They've perfected the tracking of the use of data streams from CCTV, and they're using that then to provide security services. But there's a lot of people in that space advising on that. Again, there's all the civil issues around it, but it is a growth sector. And then finally, in terms of the key lessons that we learned as a group in terms of the use of linked open data was, first and foremost, use cases are absolutely key. I mean, it goes without saying, if you don't have strong use cases, it becomes very challenging to sell the benefits of it. The linked open data web was invaluable. I mean, it's a huge data. It's very well curated. By and large, it's well maintained. The data set, the provenance by and large can be trusted. The use cases, and Horacio talked about delivery of value. You know, there's a lot of people now building applications based on open data, which are delivering real value. I mean, classic example here in Dublin is, I mean, applications for parking, applications for scheduling transport, looking at timetables and so on. So where there's real value and people have a need, they will use it and it will be adopted. It's an opportunity to validate use cases and ideas. A lot of models we would have had, we trained them, and we used some of the data from the open data platforms to validate those ideas. The scale and scope of this stuff is huge. So the whole idea of governance is going to be absolutely centrally important. You know, the management, the curation, the maintenance of that data, the data sets have to you have to keep them up to date. If they don't, people just don't bother with them. So, and that in itself costs a lot of funding in order to put in place. Data provenance, again, relates to governance. The other thing I'd say is, as people use open data, share your results. We try to make our exemplars as widely published as possible. The team were very much community-based in terms of that. They believed in the whole area of linked open data, so they were absolutely promoting what they were doing. And then the last thing I'd say is visualization is hugely powerful. I've used this. This is the from Johns Hopkins. Their tracking of COVID. It's a very simple Tableau-based visualization, but is very powerful. Just shows the value of data. As you see more in these, if you go up onto the Tableau public website and you look at what people are doing with some of the data that's out there, it's just phenomenal. So visualization sells open data. It sells the potential for it. I think it's absolutely critically important. And the last thing I'll just say, I played a big part in all the things that you've seen. The main people that made the huge impact were these three individuals here, Dr. Hesham Shokri, Pierre-Yves, and Veet. They've all remained very good friends, but they were absolutely committed to data analysis, community-based, making sure that the value of data was made available to everybody. And it was a joy to work with them. And Paul, that is it.
So I'll just get you to stop your screen share, Anthony. Thank you very much. Sarah, if we could run our second poll, please, just before we go into the panel session. But perhaps I could invite Horacio and Cyprian back up in terms of our panel session. And then we have our other people online.
We might need to jump right there, otherwise we may not be audible, right?
Okay, yes, that is a good point. So you can see the poll on the screen there. So anybody online can interact directly. But essentially, we're asking, how does your organization acquire data? So from the people in the room, whose organization buys data primarily? One, okay. Whose uses open data primarily? Both. Okay, yeah, there's one or two more hands there.
I'm actually ashamed to say that I don't believe that we have some of my students here and they don't say that they use open data. So I'm slightly concerned because they have a CA, or they have a project by the end of the term with open data. Okay, so if they don't use that, I'm concerned there.
You can see teacher afterwards for disciplinary action. Okay. And who would say then that they primarily create data in this context? Okay, so there's a couple of hands there too as well. Okay, well that's interesting to see then, that there's easily as many creating data as there are either buying or open it. And then other data sources? Anybody on the other portion? Okay.
I would say that there is certainly for academics, we have something that it's neither public nor private. There are a database, a gold standard, which is called Scopus. Strictly speaking, the information there, the data, is public, but it's a subscription based. So this is a sort of in between, no? Yeah. You create the data, but you still have to pay for that. So it's an interesting.
Interesting. And our online proportions then are similar, I suppose, to what we saw in the room. Okay. All right. I'm just going to minimize that for the moment then, because we do have Claire and Anthony still online. So we'll. Oh, sorry, I'm minimizing the wrong thing. Yeah. There we go. I assure you, I do actually know how to drive Zoom. Okay, so obviously this is an open panel session. Questions, comments, insights, we welcome all, and please do use the opportunity to talk to any of our participants today. But maybe just to let people kind of gather their thoughts and get some questions together. If we could just go back a little bit, several of the themes that we saw recurrent through all the presentations were definitions, governance, and then skills and education. So I suppose maybe, if we could start with you, from the perspective of a student or a newly minted data scientist, what are the differences in terms of working with open data that maybe people wouldn't have encountered before? What maybe are the sort of the guiding principles that you would make sure people are familiar with in embarking on work with open data?
You probably need to.
No, but that's a really good question, actually. Okay, so right until this point, people used to trust the data, right? So if you buy the data, and I've seen already handwritten there, you actually trust the source of the data, right? I mean, you actually know what you're paying for. With open data, sometimes you need to speculate whether or not the data is clean, for example. So data cleansing is really important. How the data was obtained, whether or not there are some indicators of data actually supporting something, right? I mean, you could find data in different sources. Okay, with government, we have different repositories, open data.gov, that's something else. Okay, and there are usually some serious institutions behind the data who place the data there, right? Official government institutions. If we open the data for others from other fields, things are becoming more complicated. Look, I have this data that is captured by this particular sensor. Do you actually trust my data? Do you know whether or not my sensor misfired, for example? Whether or not the sensor was placed in the right location, or how was the data created in the end, right? So there are many, many challenges behind actually opening the data in a serious way, let's say. So the data migration actually has to be supported by mature processes and policies. Yeah.
Horacio, would you like to take
I would put a very simplistic example, right? Certainly for the people in the room here, most of you got a drink, right? And why did you trust the drink that you took? Stupid question, right? So you know how it was manufactured? Are you sure? Would you trust, particularly for those of us who took this one, which is green, if I were to remove the label? What I'm trying to say is that there was some, let's call it metadata. There was some branding. I am, to a certain extent, knowing the source and getting that. If it was totally, if I get this one from an unknown source, would you trust this green water? And the same happens sometimes. I hope the online you can see. Would you trust it the same if you find this in the street? So when you go into a well-known process of acquisition, you have to first trust where you get it from, the information that it's here, and you know that there's a relation, that it describes the contents accurately, and also the applications to a certain extent. In this case, just drinking or whatever. In that case, the same. You expect to know what is in there, some of the applications and some of the purposes. And that's a serious issue for many organizations when they talk about open data. They think that if they pay they will have an assurance that someone look after that. If they don't have the assurance to do that, okay? So from that perspective, that would be the main difference here. we are trying to make sure that the common citizen now trusts to a certain degree, open data by making sure that it's curated, that has a provenance, that has a governance, that it's not just the green water without labeling, right? So that's why the creation of value and the creation of data is so important, that the sources are trustworthy and also that it's well preserved and curated. So that's why that's the interesting part in open data.
Very good. Anthony, maybe if you want to address that, given the use case that you presented and the work that you did, that a little bit earlier in the field, say, than what people in the room might be working on. So do you think there's any lessons learned in the meantime?
I think the point that Horacio has made is very important. What I would say is, if you have a data source, and it's an unpackaged bottle, just like what Horacio has presented, however, it is coming through Fujitsu, then people will trust it, because they say, well, this data source is coming through Fujitsu, and if Fujitsu trusts it, we'll trust it. So that is very important, that the data sets that we were making available and that were going to be made available through Load for All, that we maintained the provenance and made sure that what we provided, where we could stand over it. So there's an onus of obligation on people who are making data available, that they can stand over that and the source of that if they are not the source themselves. And that's a very important requirement, particularly if you look at the linked open data cloud, and they try to do that as much as they can. So, and Claire actually touched on it, you know, if you don't get that, trust falls away. So the whole idea of provenance and governance and structure around the provision of data is absolutely centrally important to confidence. And the other thing is maintaining that data. If people, you know, putting it up is great, maintaining it is another deal, and making sure that it's kept up to date is absolutely centrally important, particularly for the use cases, particularly for people who are going to use it to build applications on. So all the things Horacio said, absolutely very, very, very important.
Claire, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I'd like to agree with everything that has been said previously, and in particular the point that Anthony just made there about making sure that things are sustained over time as well. I'd probably add one more thing to it that from my experience in the open source community is, and that is that this idea of getting signals around the quality from, for example, the level of use is important, which is down to, again, I think what Horacio was talking about earlier, because certainly in the open source community, what we're finding is that, you know, there is a certain amount of risk that is associated with, for example, source code that may come from even a good brand. If, for example, there aren't many people using it, that's a signal to say, well, maybe no one's caring about this. So even if it's coming from a good brand, even if we have ascertained where it came from and that's trustworthy, it might go out of date because it's just not being used or not being cared about, and that's as dangerous as anything. So from that perspective, you can get signals around community momentum. The more people using a given source, the more people, whether it be code or data, that is a signal that that you're sharing a risk with more people. So there are more people who care. The more people who care, the better off you might be. And I'll point to the fact that can often help in the context in these days, because as was pointed out, certainly if it came from Fujitsu, it would be a trusted brand. But there are more and more startups. No one knows where they come from. Like they could be, Jim Bob in his back bedroom, deciding to put, so I who knows? Because you can't tell these days from branding on a website, right? They may look incredibly professional, but they may not be here in 6 months because he's decided to, I don't know, go off and do a master's or whatever. But the point being that, you can't ascertain things anymore just from branding or even knowing what the source is. That sustainability idea is hugely important as we build trust and make sure that we have a sustainable economic model on the back of it.
Very good. Okay, that's a very noble excuse for a startup disappearing off the scene. So we'll take that as a positive note. But any questions in the room then? Anything anybody would like to ask or comment on what we've heard so far?
It's a question that's very for Claire. Is there any concept about licensing data similar software where we have MIT, LPL, GPL, Apache, Apache 2, and so on. Do we have some development towards this kind of licensing?
Certainly.
Okay, you use my data, but it's subject to this license.
Claire, did you get that?
I think I got it. I think the question is around the licensing of open data. And actually, I don't know much at all about the licensing of open data. Obviously, there's a foundation for open source software, the OSI, who maintain and to declare all, categorize all the open source licenses. Is there equivalent in the open data world? That's an open question.
Yes, there's a general purpose license typically for the use of data. That is, the data that through the linked open cloud, they would have a general purpose data. Other data sources, for instance, if you have a publication and you quote an open data source or a public data source, they will say that we use this, and they'll give the source of that. And if you want to use that data, you need to get their permission. But typically, when it's in a public and open data forum, where an agency is managing it, there's typically a public, what they call a general purpose license.
And the typical, another one that it's now has become de facto standard is the CC0 license. So it's Creative Commons 0 license. So that means a license whereby, which is similar to the open source license, so the GPL MIT, where by using CC0, it's called CC and a 0, you are actually using data that can be openly shared and used and generated value, that you don't have to pay for that. And that is, Claire would know much better that it's preserved over time, so that you cannot sell the data that you get in that. So if you do it's CC0, a Creative Commons 0, you have that sort of similarity to open source. And now in Horizon Europe, everything that is supported by a grant, by public money pretty much, in Datasets tend to recommend that. And SFI and IRC, they have started to do that for open data.
And Paul, the European Union would have the open data license. That would be the basis under which the Irish government makes its data available, which is covered by some of the directives that Horacio spoke about. Look up open data license.
And I would just add into that then, just in the context of my work in the OSPO++ network, actually this discussion of which license to use, certainly in the open source world, but actually also perhaps covering the open data world, sometimes that can be a reason why organizations are looking to create open source program offices to make sure that there's a central place so people keep track of the different licenses people are using, because oftentimes you can start, if you leave it to an individual researcher to decide whether to use the CC0 or the CCO, sorry, or the open data license, then you can get this diversity. And it may be, sometimes it's useful to think about having a policy at an organizational level, just to make sure that people, and to educate around that. That's one of the functions of an open source program office often.
Very good, thank you. So are there any other questions in the room then? Yeah.
So what I want to thank Horacio here, and I have like a sort of like common questions. Apart from talking about Creative Commons license that are already used, for example, by Zenodo, which is like certain that we consider. So I would say that it is probably at the moment one of the best licenses to like for open data. On the other hand, I think that trust is a very important ingredient, especially when we talk about citizens. But on the other hand, as we're talking also of research data, so we also need to work on researchers. There's a attitude of like cultural change, because not all the researchers, especially when you talk about like general university, are open to openness. So, and this is an important issue to consider when working on open data. Just to give you an example, open data support research integrity. So in this sense, we know from OECD that tons of like high percentage of research is not reproducible, especially in the financial sector, of course. So sharing data it's also a matter of support the growth of research and the growth of university. So this is an important topic, I think, from the university side to be raising. And on the other hand, there's a big struggle that it is, at least to me, still not solved. And it deals also with European Commission funding and European Commission key messages, that it's out of court between openness and competitiveness, because they usually say as open as possible, as close as necessary. So it means that when we work with research data, we have to look after from one side to ensure the widest awareness, at least, or knowledge as possible. But on the other hand, we should be able to have data ready for patents, licenses, for startups, and so on. And so when we talk about this topic, I do believe that we cannot forget to talk about a general cultural change in university.
Okay, well, maybe if we could kind of characterize the question though as for maybe researchers or institutions that aren't used to working in an open culture, what can be done to encourage that from the experience in the community, first of all, and secondly, about contributing back and how best to be open in that contribution. So
I would say, Anthony, would be really interesting. How can you marry openness and open data and open source with technology transfer, patents, and generating revenue? Because can you comment on that?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of parts to the response. Number one, I would say that the people we were working with were very much champions and ambassadors for linked open data. And if the likes of Richard Sianiak was at the heart of it. So the whole culture that we operated in was that there's huge value in linked open data, there's huge value in linked data, and therefore that spirit and community was there. And if you have to create that spirit. So if you're in a research community, you need to have some people in there that are part of that community, see the value of it, and can act as ambassadors for it. In terms of the addressing commercial applications, it's difficult. But what we tried to do was we reached out into some of the customers that we had within government. And we sat with members of various government departments to look at open data, to see what types of solutions they could be delivering. We were also part of the Open Data Forum that the government set up. And we looked at different applications for transport. We looked at it around motor tax. We looked at it for licensing of vehicles. And we looked at applications that could be built. So what we tried to do was inform national strategy on that. We were then at the various conferences, we would promote the whole community as well in terms of the potential for it, the types of data that was there. And I can tell you, finally, in terms of commercial, the commercial realization, without it and without the data that has been published up there, we probably would have not gone down the path that we did around the use of it for informing the main project that we ended up with, which was looking at the whole area of cancer research. Now, we did have to enrich that, but it very much allowed us to develop the types of models, the types of architecture systems that led us then into a commercial arena. But we were always aware that what we had done was built on foundations that were there and we should share. So I'd say that mentality of sharing the data that you create as much as you can and allowing other people to see your results, that was inbred into everything we did. Make sure that we promote.
Very good, thank you. Claire, I know you're under a little bit of time pressure, so it brings
well, if I can I just want to add one thing to that, because again, Anthony's suggestions are all amazing. I would also say that if people are interested in that topic, just because we spend a lot of time talking about that in Inner Source Commons, like organizational change, how to gain awareness. So there are great patterns out there for people to do that, and they're kind of been well explored at this stage. I will just recommend very quickly a book called Fearless Change by, I don't know if you can see that, I don't know. I'll send the link anyway. It's by Linda Rising and Mary Lynn Mans, and it literally has patterns for how you do exactly what that lady was asking about, which is about this idea of both top down and bottom, grassroots, bottom up type awareness and perception changing to help people do whatever. So I definitely recommend that.
Right, thank you, and that's good, because as everybody has observed, I'm sure, in their own organizations, cultural change is often the hardest, and the technological often follows. But Sarah, if we could run our last poll, because it ties in nicely with several themes that we were talking about there. So again, what are the barriers for your organization to acquire data? And trust has come up several times. So in the first option there, is a trust of the source a barrier to acquiring data? Any hands there? Okay, there's three or four. Access to the data, is accessing data an issue in acquiring? No, okay, well, that's good. Is cost an issue? Again, kind of following up from those who buy data. Yeah, okay, so there's a couple of concerns there too. Okay, and we can see, yeah, cost and trust are there. So, okay, I think given the we saw earlier in terms of the top contributors and the fact that Ireland is in there, making the data available and general access to open data sources seems to be quite good. So it's other things that block. So that's encouraging to see. Okay, I'm just going to minimize that poll then for the moment. So, Claire, I understand you're under time pressure, so feel free to drop out when you need to. But we'll continue on. If there's any more questions in the room, would anyone else like to ask a question or make an observation on anything that's been seen so far? Okay. Well, maybe just to address some of the other issues we were talking about. So, say from your collective experience, once you actually embark on an open data project, even with the trust issues and the access issues and acquisition, all of that sort of, what are the kinds of stumbling blocks you tend to meet as you actually progress with the projects? So maybe Cyprian, would you like to comment first?
Yeah, but first, I'd like to continue on the same note and basically to reach to what you are asked. Okay, so by definition, just to reply to your previous question, the European Commission, for example, right, regards open data as free data, free lunch, let's say, which is okay, but of course the industry adapted quite quickly. And again, this comes from the biohealth sector. They invented another term, which is called open proprietary data, actually to retain basically the part related with the free source. And from my perspective, technology also advances in time with what we are seeing as the industry does, right? Doing something like that already happened as a cultural shift probably 10 years ago. Clark here maybe know better than me, with the open source software progress, right? Basically, all the major companies, Bosch, Google, and many others actually created, let's say, group of support for opening the source code to others, to actually understand or rely a better understanding to developers what kind of, for example, license agreement they should put on their software and under what terms, just to follow the same interest as the company, right? So probably in the end, we'll see something similarly done also with the open proprietary data. So if we want to open the data, we need still to preserve the provenance of the data. And in terms of technology, why I'm saying that basically technology progresses in the same manner. We already have something called NFTs. Probably you all heard of this, right? Basically digital proofs that the data is there. And they are already applied for digital images, basically digital assets altogether, right? People are making lots of money nowadays with NFTs, for example. The problem with NFTs, of course, they are easily stolen. I mean, take any image, change one pixel and it's a completely different image in terms of NFTs, right? So I can actually be the owner of Mona Lisa, for example, and sell it to others. Okay, it's not something true, but we can see that. And we believe that science has the solution also in long terms actually to support data provenance in, even in case of somebody wanting to preserve the data provenance. Why am I saying this? Okay, I take the data, for example, from Fujitsu. Okay, now the data comes from there, and then I can become another seller of the same data. And we can see today many companies being developed around the data concept. You probably all heard about Uber, for example, Airbnb. All these are companies creating actually value around data. Uber has no car, no servers actually altogether. Airbnb the same. So basically they sell information, right? Where is the information coming from? In this particular case, from their own applications. But for example, if I want to create another company, let's call it Lala company, right? A new SME. And I want actually to create the next generation application for smart cities to actually mediate the traffic. I'm not Google. If you're not Google, you don't have many, let's say, variable data from traffic. You don't know exactly what is the congestion in traffic. And you can actually see in many cases, taxi drivers actually using two applications, two smartphones. On one side, they actually use the application like Google Traffic, Waze, something that actually gets the data they need, right? To see exactly where to circulate around the city. The other one, they take actually the next, let's say, client, right? And you cannot mix the two together. If I want, for example, to create an application where I take this company, okay, the company has a fleet of cars, 10, 20, but insufficient actually to understand better what the traffic conditions are in a city. And I take the next company with another 10, 20 other fleet of cars. Okay. And I want to put them together in the same platform, right? Why? Because this actually adds value. If I do that for several others, basically I can create the next generation routing cars, right? Routing applications. So I become a competitor actually for Google and other big players on the market, okay? It's a simple application, but it relies on data. So do you think that I'll be successful on the long term? I already tried it, I know the answer. And the answer is no. Lala company is nobody on the market. Lala company has no name, no brand. How do I associate the data with the right quality, right? I mean, I become a seller of a virtual sensor, let's say, right? And but if I go then to a client saying, look, I have all this data collected, I can sell it like a virtual sensor. You don't have sensors in the city, right? You don't know exactly where the congestion are, but I know it already. Do you know what the answer will be? How do I trust you? Who are you? Lala company. Okay, I don't know who you are. Basically, it's again a problem of whether or not you trust the data quality. This is exactly what we are facing in terms of adding value to businesses. Okay? Yeah.
Very good. Thank you.
I guess I was just thinking about the Deliveroo guys being data source. Anyway, yeah, I think it's more this idea of my green water, and then how do you trust if it's already tampered? But the point Andrea was making is very valuable, because there is always tension between a technology transfer that wants to get a patent and get lots of royalties and money, and the openness and reproducibility, or at least a perceived tension. And I would say that the open data, it's where open source, and it's a pity that Claire had to drop, is where open source was about 20 years at the turn of the century, where you have tons of licenses, tons of modes to have open source. Linux was still trying to win the battle against the proprietary operating systems. So open data is in that area where open source was 20 years ago, and that we thought it was not going to succeed. So I think it will be there at some point, and that's why we managed to get the European Commission to get us some money to try to ascertain that it works or not.
Very good. Okay.
Oh, could I just the value of data is absolutely key. I mean, making data public for the sake of it doesn't progress matters. What you need is valuable data, and where you see data, I mean, a classic example, Transport for London. I had the opportunity to meet with them. They make data available across all their transport systems, bike lending the lot. It's led to lots of startups developing, lots of applications, and as such, the open data community grows. So valuable data being made available makes a huge difference. So value and make it available.
Very good. Okay. Well, we're slightly over time. We'll take one last question from the floor. If anybody would like to, yes, certainly.
Because in engineering domains and subdomains, the data are very different format and so on. It's very important to work with the data and to make them fair, but it's very important also to be standardized. Because if one told about the connection between this data with a different historical equipment and so on, all this data, and all could be also standardized. And it's very important when we discuss about research data management, we will discuss also this.
Okay. Very good. Thank you very much for that contribution. Sorry, would you like to add?
Yeah, I can visit open data growing in size of just interested in some discovery services that I actually search for relevant data in this vast universe of things.
A very good question.
That's a very interesting one, because some of the commercial companies have started to have their own search services, the European data portal. But to be honest, Anthony, I wasn't familiar with the project that you mentioned with Fujitsu, that they were trying to have some semantic search. I guess the word semtex didn't fly very well in Ireland. So semantics, it's very important, because again, it's the same. No, it's imagine at the turn of the century, if anyone can remember, I'm old enough to remember when there were a myriad of search engines that were looking at the internet, and Alta Vista was the best. Yes, it was. And that had an implication. No? If you look at that way in open data, today try to find something and all our islands. I don't know. I don't have. So can you comment on that, Anthony, about the possibility of finding open data? You're muted.
You're muted.
In terms of, is it respect to the semantic?
In general, it's semantic, but in general, how can you find open data? So if you can comment of the issue of...
So if you're working in a particular discipline and there might be a primary source, say, for example, and, fleshing that out, finding other similar sources, search engines or search services.
We were trying to, that's what the load for all application was trying to do, that Fujitsu were trying to develop. But in terms of probably the best location is, and I know it's a linked open data platform, but the load cloud is, I mean, it's a huge source now in terms of open data that is validated by them. It's across a huge number of domains. It's called the load cloud, and as far as I'm aware of, in terms of open data, linked open data, it was the place to go. After that, I mean, the places that I tended to go were trusted locations, like what you've said, the World Economic Forum, the OECD. But again, you're going from one site to another. In terms of a centralized source, we found that the LOD cloud was the best.
Very good. Okay. All right. we're just a little bit over time, so I think we might wrap it there. So thank you very much to everybody for attending. Thank you to all our panelists. Thank you to ICT SkillNet for hosting us online and NCI for hosting us in person. Thank you all for your contributions. I think it was a very interesting debate, and I think Claire and Anthony's perspective then in terms of the wider industry puts a really good context there for it. So thank you very much, everybody. And reminder that there's still more refreshments here and everything. So anybody who hasn't had, please feel free. And thank you very much. And we will close it there.
Bye, everybody. Have a good day.